40 years has seen a great emergence of interest in language and literacy education. Can you make some comment on that in relation to the teaching of writing, and particularly draw our attention to where PETAA's made a contribution to this emergence of interest?
Well, I think that the last 40 years have been very significant for the development of what we call language and literacy education. This became a theme. It was not actually a term that was being used in 1970, but it's become a term that's familiarly part of the discourse of teachers today, and it's familiarly part of teacher education programs. We train teachers for the teaching of language and literacy education. It's a very important development, and PETAA made a major contribution across those 40 years, which were also internationally significant, of course. And in those years, the teaching of reading and writing, in particular, became major themes for PETAA. Very few people remember that, or even know, that the word literacy is historically very recent. The word literate was an old one, but literacy became a term that we discussed as a profession over the last few years, really from the 1980s on, and of course it was marked even with the International Literacy Year. And I remind myself that Halliday, Professor Halliday, who was the active professor, one of them, interested in language and literacy education over those years, actually developed a program that was called Breakthrough to Literacy, which put a big focus on the teaching of writing. Now, from its earliest years, PETAA took a major leadership role in preparing teachers, enlightening them, discussing with them, exciting them about the teaching of language and literacy, and writing as one dimension of that.
Why are the terms language and literacy so important?
Very important, I think, and I have at least 3 reasons that I offer, although there are perhaps others. Use of the term language itself, which was historically relatively recent, brings our attention to the importance of language as a resource or a tool for learning. As children come into the world and in their preschool years, before they prepare for schooling, oral language itself is a major resource with which they make so much sense of the world, and it's a major tool for learning. So the focus on language from that point of view is very important. Secondly, talking about literacy, rather than reading and writing, focuses on the very intimate relationship of reading and writing. They're 2 dimensions of the literate mode, as we call it, and children in schools are learning literacy where that's got aspects of both reading and writing. They are to be understood as very intimately related. And then the third thing I would say is that if we talk of literacy as distinct from language, we are drawing attention to the fact that literacy itself is different from language. It's different, not better than it, and in fact oral language remains the mode we use most in life. But literate language is different, it has a different grammar, a different grammatical organisation, and that's important for teachers to understand, because a major responsibility of the primary years, the years that PETAA is concerned with, is teaching children to be literate, where that has writing as a very important dimension.
What's been the model of language development which has informed our thinking and practice over the years?
Well, I refer to the National Language Development Project, which was very influential in Australia in the 70s and 80s, and it adopted a model of language development that came from Professor Halliday, who argued that language development, looking at children in life, before school and in school, language development had 3 dimensions. They were learning language, learning through language, and learning about language. Learning language means learning the basic resource, which is language, its grammar, its sounds, its syntax, the whole lot. Learning through language is learning about the world, learning about relationships, learning about, of course, the subjects of schooling, all of those things. And then learning about language is that which involves formal teaching and learning about the language, its literate modes, its patterns of expression. It's a very wide sense of thinking about language in that third way, the learning about language. Now, that was a very interesting model of language development to adopt, and it was also quite controversial, because there were, for some people in the early 70s, there were arguments that said that, well, you shouldn't have teaching about language because children should be free to express themselves independently and not be fettered with too much formal teaching of knowledge about language. But over the years, and again, the PETAA publications have undoubtedly contributed to this, we've recognised the importance of allowing children to express themselves, encouraging them to write independently, but at the same time developing models of language development which do overtly teach knowledge about the written mode, about its text types, its ways of expressing experience, which make participation in the classroom and in the wider community so important. So that model of language development has shaped a great deal of thinking for the last 40 years, and it's been very significant. And if one reviews the many publications of PETAA, one can see there are a number which look quite specifically at teaching knowledge about language, teaching knowledge about writing. I mentioned one by Bev Derevianka, which is well known. Libby Gleason has produced a very good book on writing. There are many others that I've alluded to in the website essay that accompanies this interview. So by any standards, PETAA has led the way in a lot of thinking about teaching knowledge about language and about writing in particular.
Can you elaborate on some of the linguistic theory which informed our teaching at this time?
Yes, a number of terms have come into use that we've taken mainly from systemic theory, used in some cases in other traditions of linguistics too, and in some cases distinctive to systemic theory or functional theory. The notion of text itself, let's start with that. The notion of text is something that has become commonplace and is in the National English curriculum, I see. A text is any passage of language which is meaningful. And so the theory says that whenever we use language, we produce text, either in speech or in writing. We don't produce isolated words or phrases. We always predict text which carry a particular kind of meaning. That's important. When we're teaching children, we're teaching texts, teaching them to construct texts which are always meaningful, carry some kind of purpose. Associated with text, of course, is the notion of context. Text is relevant to context. Text and context are intimately associated. So those have become dimensions of primary English teaching thinking. Another and associated term is that of register, the notion that when you produce texts in particular contexts, you shift register. And the register shift is always to do with the field, the content, the experience you're dealing with, the relationship you have with your listener or your reader, and of course the mode, the third one, is to do with the organisation of the text to make meaning. So you've got the three dimensions of register: field, tenor to do with relationship, and mode to do with the organisation of the text to make meaning. The other term is text type. Again, that's familiarly part of the discourse of teachers now. When children are writing, they're learning to write different text types, whether they are narratives, procedures, reports, explanations, and so on. Each of those is a particular text type carrying a particular meaning. And then the most recent and interesting term that's come into use, and PETAA is right up there with a new publication that uses the term, is the notion of semiotics. Because all these things, this is a very recent phenomenon in linguistic theory, at least as it relevance for teaching. Semiotics is to do with meaning making. So we're told that using language is a form of semiotics. If we study language, it is a semiotic study. John Callow's most recent book, for which PETAA is to be congratulated in that it's just releasing it at this very moment, introduces the terms semiotics and semiotic theory in looking at the way students and others make meaning in multimodal texts. So PETAA is right up there at the forefront with publications which use all these terms: text, text type, register, semiotics. And in this way, it is helping to shape the thinking of the English teaching profession in Australia in a very positive sense.
One of the themes that emerged during this time was the teaching of students from non-English speaking background. Can you comment briefly on this for us?
Yes, I think Australia has a lot to be proud of in its profession of teachers of English as a second language. Not everyone knows this, that it was in 1970 that the then Minister of Immigration, Billy Snedden, announced the starting of the Child Migrant Education Program. It was one of the first in the world because it was a recognition that children who were coming here at that stage, children of migrants, not refugees, needed appropriate provision for learning English as a second language. Now, the world has changed. We didn't talk of ESL students in 1970. We familiarly talk of the teaching of English as a second language today. And PETAA has taken a role in producing a number of publications. Some of them are books such as one by Pauline Gibbons. Others are tucked away in chapters of books edited by someone like Jenny Hammond. Quite a variety of publications now. This is a very important dimension for PETAA to be involved with. There's no school in Australia in which there are not children who are second language learners. All teachers in Australian schools are teachers of English as a second language. That wasn't something recognised in 1970. I remember I was a young teacher, but it is understood today, and PETAA does make a contribution in recognising that all our classrooms have second language students in them, and also recognising that teachers should be prepared to help them, assist them, deal with them, and also respect the other languages that they speak, the children in the classrooms, as well as teaching them English as a second language.
Can you outline some steps in the development of writing in the primary years, please?
Always worth remembering that the primary years are where the critical foundations of a great deal of writing behaviour is established. So the primary teacher has a very important role in teaching children to write across those years. In the website essay that I've written accompanying this interview, I have displayed several texts written by children and have attempted to demonstrate something of the steps they take from age 5 or 6 when they enter school, around that age, up to the last year of the primary school before they enter the secondary school. So I'll sketch in some of the steps that are involved, but people interested in this should look at the text that I've displayed on the website for closer discussion. In the first years, a lot of little kids will be doing pretty pictures, drawings, and writing with them. And certainly Gunter Kress, who's done some research on this, argues that writing comes as a necessary semiotic behaviour after drawing. And he's right in that a great deal of drawing is a first step towards writing, and one of the texts I've displayed that's true of. It's not necessarily the case that other children, once into school, start to write in different ways, and you discover when you look closely at the writing they do that they're using pretty much the grammar of speech. They're writing simple texts with very simple clauses. Why are they doing this? Partly because the effort of writing is considerable, learning the spelling system, learning the writing system, that's effortful, it's hard work, and partly because children understand best the grammar of speech when they're 5, 6, 7. Learning the grammar of writing takes longer. By about the mid-primary school, where children are coping and succeeding well, you begin to see an expansion of meanings. The texts often get a little longer. You'll get some diversity in the kind of text types that children write, but that depends on teacher support, scaffolding, encouragement as well. But narratives begin to appear, and narratives have a particular structure that needs to be discussed, thought about, reviewed from books that children read in classroom, and some collective support often in writing narratives together or writing reports, writing procedures. All these sorts of things can be done collectively, individually, or done in group situations. The texts get longer, the grammatical organisation tends to get a little different in that more information is compressed into the texts. There's a different, what we call thematic progression as the texts unfold and grow longer. These days, of course, many children are quite early producing multimodal texts, and I've displayed one in the essay on the website where the child has worked very hard, I think, and quite successfully at building a relationship between the written text and the images and a map in one case that she displays. And then by the last years of primary school, where children are succeeding well, they can write longer texts which show something of the dense characteristics of written language. That is to say, more information is compressed into the text. The texts become longer. There's a greater sense of thematic progression, organisation throughout the text as it unfolds. This is quite a demanding thing to learn to do, because we must remind ourselves that we are never exposed to the model of written language as much as we are to the model of speech. And where children are disadvantaged, and I have alluded to one study about disadvantaged children in my essay on the website, they need a great deal of support in learning about written language by exposure to the good models of written texts, listening to the sound of the teacher's voice, reading text to them. An enormous amount of work is to be done in modelling written language so that children can begin to master the grammar, the organisation of written language as they leave from primary school and move into secondary situations.
Can you summarise these developments for us?
Yes, very significant 40 years, and PETAA has had a major contribution. As I said in the early part of the interview, one of the first points I'd note is the fact that language and literacy education has become a major and indeed very important theme in teacher education, familiarly part of the terms and the language that teachers use. We speak of language and literacy education. So that's a very fundamental development, which was not a feature of life in the profession in Australia when PETAA started. Secondly is the recognition, therefore, that all teachers are teachers of English language and literacy. And while that was perhaps always understood in the primary school, it always needs to be affirmed and reaffirmed. All teachers are teachers of language and literacy, and that's been a very important recognition. Thirdly, learning language, using the ideas that Halliday gave us, involves learning language, learning through language, and those are simultaneous dimensions of language development. And the third one, the important learning about language, is a major theme, and PETA's various publications attest to the importance of that. But the best model is one which brings those three together: learning language, learning through language, learning about language. So the activity of learning about language is seen as a necessary part of engaging with learning through language. It becomes lively, interesting, an important part of children's understanding, and of course we want them to have pleasure in their learning in schools. And then, of course, a major theme for this interview, that writing development is critical in that thing which is language development and language and literacy education across all the years of schooling. Again, that's become a major theme. It used to be reading and writing, now it's writing development as a necessary dimension of language and literacy education. A very important development that PETAA has had a major role in developing, fostering, teaching the profession to think about writing development in new ways. And I would add, in concluding this discussion, that I think PETAA is a very impressive organisation. The range of publications it's produced, the range of conferences it organises, the very scholarly way in which its publications are produced means it's taking a major leadership role in Australia for the profession of primary teachers of English. And I wish PETAA well, and like Peter Freebody in his interview, I'd say, you've had 40 years and I look forward to seeing the next 40 as being just as good and continuing to offer a major leadership role to the profession of teachers in this country.
Thank you very much for that, Fran. And yes, we're hoping this is the beginning of the next 40 years.